All right, folks. Welcome back to Study Hall.
Mm.
You know where we like to break down complex stuff, so you don't have to. And today, we're tackling something that sounds like it's straight out of a spy thriller, the BioSecure Act.
Ooh,
Buckle up, because this one's a doozy.
it certainly raises some interesting questions.
You bet it does. Okay,
Yes.
so imagine a world where the government can't buy certain biotech stuff from certain companies. That's essentially what this bill, H.R. 8333, is all about. Now, why should you care?
Right?
Well, because this could have ripple effects on everything from national security to the cost of your medications.
It touches on a lot of critical areas.
It does. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What does this BioSecure Act actually do? I mean, in plain English, please.
Okay, so essentially, it prohibits U.S. government agencies from contracting with certain biotechnology companies.
Okay.
We're talking buying equipment,
Yeah.
using their services, even getting grants from organizations that use tech from these companies.
So like a no-buy list for biotech?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of dramatic, don't you think?
It is a strong measure designed to address specific concerns about national security and data privacy.
Okay. Intrigue level rising. Tell me more about these companies of concern.
Right.
Who are these shadowy figures?
Well, there are two categories. The first is pretty straightforward. 5 specific companies, all Chinese.
Okay.
BGI, MGI, Complete Genomics, WuXi AppTech, and WuXi Biologics.
Interesting. So these companies are automatically on the naughty list. What about the second category?
This one's broader. It includes any company under the control of a foreign adversary that's involved in biotech activities and poses a risk to U.S. national security.
Okay.
That's where things get a little more complex.
Wait, back up a sec. What kind of risks are we talking about here? Should I be picturing some kind of bioweapon scenario?
It's not quite Hollywood, but the concerns are real.
Okay.
The bill lays out 3 specific risk criteria. First, if a company is collaborating with a foreign adversary's military or intelligence agencies, that's a red flag.
Okay, that makes sense. What's
Yeah.
next on the risk checklist?
Second, if a company provides something called multi-omic data to a foreign adversary's government that triggers the alarm bells.
Hold on. Multi-omic data. That sounds like something my doctor would mutter while looking at my blood work. What is that exactly?
Think of it as a super detailed biological blueprint. It combines genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, basically a comprehensive picture of your biological makeup.
Wow, so it's way more than just your DNA.
Right.
That's kind of creepy, but also kind of cool.
Yeah.
But why would that be a national security risk?
Well, imagine a foreign government having access to that kind of detailed information about U.S. citizens.
Okay.
The potential for misuse is huge. We're talking targeted bioweapons, personalized propaganda, even blackmail based on your genetic predispositions.
Okay, yeah. Now I'm seeing the spy thriller angle here.
Right.
That's some serious Black Mirror stuff.
Yeah.
And the third risk criteria.
This one's about ethics. If a company obtains this multi-omic data without clear, informed consent, that's a violation. So it's not just what they're doing with the data, but how they're getting it in the first place.
So it's like a triple whammy. Bad actors, sensitive data, and potentially unethical collection practices.
Got it. But I'm guessing it's not always forbidden to work with these companies, right? What if there's a medical emergency or something?
There are a few exceptions, yes. The bill allows for certain activities like intelligence gathering related to national security or providing health care overseas to U.S. government employees.
Okay.
And there's a provision for using multi-omic data that's already publicly or commercially available.
So there's some wiggle room. But I bet it's not as simple as just saying, oops, we need this. Never mind the rules.
Right.
There's got to be a process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
For anything outside those specific exceptions, government agencies would need to apply for a waiver to contract with these companies. It requires high-level approval and a detailed justification to Congress.
Sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare, honestly.
Hmm.
But I guess that's how they try to prevent abuse, right?
The goal is to make sure any exceptions are truly justified and not just a way to skirt the rules. Okay, fair enough. So we've got this list of companies of concern, we've got these risk criteria, and we've got this whole waiver process. It's a lot to take in. What's the overall reaction to this bill? Are people freaking out?
There's definitely a lot of debate, strong arguments on both sides.
Well, let's break it down. Who's in favor of this bill and why?
Supporters argue it's absolutely essential for national security, especially given the rapid advancements in biotechnology happening globally. They're worried about foreign adversaries, particularly China, gaining access to sensitive biological data or influencing the U.S. biotech industry.
So basically they're saying it's better to be safe than sorry, even if it means shaking things up a bit.
That's a good summary. They believe the potential risks are just too great to ignore.
All right, I could see that perspective. But what about the other side? What are the critics saying?
They're worried about overreach. They argue the bill could stifle innovation and hinder legitimate scientific collaboration. They also fear it could make it harder for U.S. companies to compete globally.
So it's a classic trade-off between security and progress, right?
Exactly. Striking the right balance is the challenge, and there's no easy answer.
Wow. This is complicated stuff. But we've only just scratched the surface here, folks.
Right.
We still need to dive deeper into how this bill could actually be implemented, the potential economic fallout, and the ethical considerations.
And let's not forget about the potential impact on U.S. foreign policy, especially with China.
Right, we got a whole lot more to unpack. So
Okay.
stay tuned, because this study hall session is far from over.
Welcome back to Study Hall, where we're dissecting the BioSecure Act and all its implications.
We're knee-deep in this biotech thriller now, folks.
Yeah.
And trust me, it's getting even juicier.
Perhaps complex is a more fitting term.
Okay, fine, complex.
Yeah.
But definitely not boring. We've laid out the what and the who, but now let's get into the how. If this bill actually becomes law, how would they even enforce it? Are we going to have like biotech police patrolling labs and combing through contracts?
Not quite. It would likely be a mix of regulatory oversight and internal compliance within government agencies.
All right, break that down for me. Regulation always sounds a little scary.
Well, remember that group we mentioned, the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, or FAR Council? They're like the rule makers for government contracts.
Yeah, the ones who turn vague laws into concrete rules.
Exactly. They'd be responsible for translating the Biosecure Act into specific procedures. Think things like approved vendor lists, standardized screening processes, and clear guidelines for those waivers we discussed.
Sounds like a lot of paperwork and red tape.
Yeah.
I can already picture those poor government workers drowning in forms.
It would definitely add complexity, no doubt. But it's important to have clear rules to minimize any unintended consequences.
I get that.
Yeah.
But rules are only as good as the people following them, right? How do we know agencies will actually comply? What's stopping someone from cutting corners?
That's where internal compliance comes in. Each agency would likely develop its own procedures and training programs to make sure their staff understands the Biosecure Act and knows how to apply it to their work. Think mandatory training modules, internal audits, and even designated compliance officers to keep everyone in check.
So a whole new layer of bureaucracy. Just what everyone loves, right?
It might seem that way at first, but the goal is to integrate these compliance measures into existing workflows, not create a separate monster. It's about building awareness and a sense of responsibility within the agencies when dealing with biotech, especially those companies linked to foreign adversaries.
Okay, I can see the logic there.
Huh.
But let's be real for a sec. All this oversight and regulation, it's going to cost money, right? What kind of economic impact are we talking about here?
It's a complex question with a lot of moving parts. On the one hand, it could lead to increased costs for the government.
How so? Are we talking higher taxes?
Not necessarily, but if agencies are limited in who they can work with, they might face higher prices or have fewer options for certain biotech products and services. Plus, the administrative burden of implementing all these new rules and regulations could also add to the costs.
So taxpayers might end up footing the bill one way or another.
It's a possibility, but supporters of the bill argue that it's a small price to pay for protecting national security and preventing potentially far greater economic losses down the line.
Okay, I see their point. But what about the impact on the U.S. biotech industry itself? Could this backfire and end up hurting American companies?
That's a key concern for critics. They argue that the bill could create an unfair advantage for foreign companies that aren't subject to the same restrictions, making it harder for U.S. companies to compete globally.
So it's like shooting ourselves in the foot.
That's the argument, yes. They also worry that the focus on national security might discourage investment in the U.S. biotech sector, driving innovation and capital overseas.
And that would obviously be bad news for the U.S. economy.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act. The goal is to protect national security without stifling innovation or harming American businesses. Whether the Biosecure Act achieves that balance remains to be seen.
All right, time to address the elephant in the room, China. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
This bill is at least partly about curbing China's growing influence in biotech.
It's certainly a major part of the context. China has been investing heavily in biotech, and its companies are becoming increasingly competitive on the global stage. The bill's focus on companies linked to foreign adversaries, plus the fact that all 5 named companies are Chinese, suggests an attempt to counter China's growing presence in the strategic sector.
So could this bill trigger some serious diplomatic tension between the U.S. and China? Are we talking trade wars, sanctions?
It's definitely a possibility. If China sees this as a direct attack on its companies and economic growth, they might retaliate.
Like how? What kind of retaliation are we talking about?
They could impose their own restrictions on U.S. companies operating in China, limit access to their markets, or even ramp up cyber espionage to get their hands on U.S. biotech research and intellectual property.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It's a complex geopolitical game with high stakes, and the BioSecure Act is just one move.
Okay. Let's shift gears for a bit and talk about the ethical side of things. We touched on informed consent earlier, but this bill raises a lot of questions about data privacy and potential genetic discrimination.
Absolutely. In a world where our biological data is becoming increasingly valuable and accessible, we need to be incredibly careful about who has access to it and how it's used.
Imagine your health insurance company getting a hold of your multi-omic data and denying you coverage because you have a higher risk for a certain condition. That's terrifying.
It's a valid concern, and something lawmakers need to address as biotech advances. We need strong legal protections to make sure our genetic information isn't used against us.
No one wants to live in a Gattaca-style world
Right.
where your genes determine your destiny.
Right.
But how do we balance individual privacy with the need for scientific research and progress?
That's the million-dollar question. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Robust privacy laws, ethical guidelines for researchers, and public education to raise awareness about the importance of genetic privacy.
So it's not just about passing laws. It's about creating a culture of respect for genetic privacy.
Precisely. And that's not something that happens overnight. It requires effort from everyone, policymakers, scientists, industry leaders, and the public.
Phew. This is a lot to process.
Oh.
We've covered everything from bureaucratic nightmares to international espionage, and even touched on some serious ethical dilemmas. I think we all need a moment to catch our breath.
A mental reset is in order.
Don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back to wrap things up after a quick message. And we're back, folks, for the final round of our Biosecure Act deep dive.
Consider this the synthesis stage where we bring all the pieces together.
Exactly. We've covered a lot of ground, from shady companies and shadowy risks to bureaucratic hurdles and potential trade wars.
It's been a whirlwind tour of the intersection between biotechnology and national security.
You can say that again. But before we wrap things up, let's take a minute to recap the key takeaways. What are the essential things listeners need to remember about this bill?
At its core, the Biosecure Act aims to restrict U.S. government agencies from doing business with certain biotechnology companies deemed companies of concern.
And those companies fall into two categories.
Right, precisely. First, there's the specific list of 5 Chinese companies: BGI, MGI Complete Genomics, WeG AppTech, and WeG Biologics.
Those are the ones automatically on the no-fly list.
Then there's the broader category: any company under foreign adversary control, involved in biotech and posing a risk to U.S. national security.
And those risks boil down to 3 main things: collaborating with foreign military or intelligence, sharing sensitive multi-omic data with a foreign government, or obtaining that data without informed consent.
Exactly. And remember, multi-omic data is like a super detailed biological blueprint, potentially revealing incredibly sensitive information about individuals. That's why it's such a focal point of concern.
Right, it's like the ultimate health profile on steroids. But the bill does have those exceptions and a waiver process for special cases.
Correct. It's not a complete ban, but it definitely adds hurdles and oversight to any dealings with these companies of concern.
And we've talked about the potential fallout, implementation challenges, economic impacts, diplomatic tensions with China, and those tricky ethical questions about data privacy and genetic discrimination.
It's a multifaceted issue with far-reaching implications.
No kidding. So what happens next? This bill passed the House, but is it a done deal? Will it actually become law?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, there's no crystal ball. It still needs to go through the Senate and then get the president's signature. And as we've discussed, there's considerable pushback from various groups worried about stifling innovation and hindering scientific collaboration.
So it's going to be a bumpy ride.
You can count on it. There will be a lot of debate and scrutiny in the Senate, and it's possible the bill could be amended or even completely stalled.
Okay, so we'll have to wait and see. But just for fun, let's put on our prognosticator hats for a minute. Let's assume this bill does become law. What kind of long-term impact could we be looking at?
Well, it could reshape the entire landscape of the biotech industry, both here in the U.S. and internationally.
Give me the details. What kind of reshaping are we talking about?
Domestically, we could see a lot more government scrutiny of biotech companies, especially those with foreign connections. Think stricter regulations, more rigorous vetting for contracts, and even heightened security measures for research labs and data storage.
So basically, a lot more hoops to jump through
Yeah.
for biotech companies operating in the U.S.
Yes. But it could also lead to a renewed focus on homegrown innovation and a push to reduce reliance on foreign companies for those essential biotech products and services.
So a potential silver lining for American companies.
Yep.
Interesting. What about the global scene? How could this impact things on an international level?
Well, it could definitely strain U.S.-China relations even further, especially if China sees this as a move to contain their economic and technological ambitions. It could also trigger a wave of copycat legislation in other countries, concerned about foreign influence in their own biotech sectors.
So we could end up in a global biotech arms race. Everyone's scrambling to dominate the field.
It's not impossible.
Yep.
Countries might start fiercely competing to develop their own biotech industries and secure access to key resources and talent.
And that competition could be both a good thing and a bad thing.
Right.
Exactly. On the one hand, it could push innovation to new heights, leading to groundbreaking discoveries in medicine, agriculture, energy, you name it. But on the other hand, it could fuel distrust and create barriers to collaboration, ultimately hindering scientific progress.
And potentially even increasing the risk of someone using biotech for harmful purposes. A little scary to think about.
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
One thing's for sure. The Biosecure Act signals a major shift in how the U.S. government approaches the intersection of biotechnology and national security.
And it raises a lot of questions we need to grapple with as a society. Questions about the role of government in regulating new technologies, the balance between security and innovation, and the ethical implications of this whole biotech revolution.
These are big, complicated questions with no easy answers.
Absolutely. But they're questions we can't afford to ignore.
Yeah.
So listeners, as you go about your day, I want you to think about this. If you were in charge, how would you balance the promise of biotech with the potential risks? What values would you prioritize? It's a thought-provoking exercise, to say the least.
It really is, and it's a conversation we all need to be part of. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the Biosecure Act. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit entertaining.
It's always a pleasure unpacking these complex issues with you.
And as always, thanks for joining us in Study Hall. Remember, folks, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those brains buzzing. Until next time.